Welcome to the Bible Nerd Club, bridging the gap between the lab and the pulpit, between the microscope and the microphone. Today, we're going to visit a small piece of scripture that seems more like an extract from a university-level biology handout written 2,000 years before the microscope was invented. And that verse in particular is John 1 verse 13. We all know what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. Bang! So now we are about to find out what happens when science meets the Bible. Coming up next on The Bible Nerd. In the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 13, the author lists three very specific physical ways that humans are conceived, or rather reproduced. Most people skim over this verse, thinking they are just poetic ways of saying the same thing. But if you look closer, through the lens of modern science, it looks like John was categorizing every possible way to create a human being. In that verse, John wrote, "Who were born? 1, not of blood. 2, nor of the will of flesh. 3, nor of the will of man. And 4, but of God." Now, this might seem like a normal, ordinary, simple Bible verse, grounded in absolute theology, in which the Apostle John is basically highlighting the difference between a spiritual birth and a physical birth, and emphatically pointing out that being born of God, which is the spiritual birth, is not anything like being born physically. And yap, to the general reader of the Bible, case closed. But here is the problem. This verse in particular has caused some very serious scholarly headaches over the past millennia, and that's because while John offers to differentiate between a spiritual birth and one that is not, he gives three very distinct physical mechanisms in which a person can be born. And why is this a problem? It's because theologically, we are only aware of one outlined method of physical reproduction, which is the natural method, birth by blood. That's the natural mechanism. It's the inherited DNA from father and mother, the standard genetic handoff. 1 sperm, 1 egg, a mix of 2 bloodlines, and a linear path from ancestor to child. So John's first point is simple. An inheritance of DNA means an inheritance of blood. But if this is clear, then why did he mention 2 other mechanisms? Birth by the will of the flesh and birth by the will of man. What does that mean? If they are not just the same as the first mentioned mechanism, which is the natural process, then why did John go on to list these 2 other mechanisms separately? And this is why the translators of other later versions of the Bible tried best to correlate the other 2 mechanisms to the natural process, though it worsened the redundancy crisis. When John said, "nor of the will of the flesh," standard theology says this just refers to sexual desire. But here at the Bible Nerd Club, we like to look deeper. Think about twinning, specifically identical twins. Before the discovery of molecular biology, science used to think that both identical twins came as a direct result of the act of their parents. But after research, it was discovered that while the first twin is the direct result of the parents' union, the second twin is the result of the cell's own internal spontaneous decision to divide. It is a birth triggered by the flesh itself, independent of the parents' initial act. Today, the trigger for twinning is one of biology's greatest mysteries. And while many people think that identical twins form at the moment of fertilization, modern research shows that the duplication process, which medically is known as mitosis, can take place 6 to 7 days later. Mitosis is not a conscious decision of the parents, it is purely a cellular mechanism. The initial fertilized cell spontaneously duplicates itself, and this is why the Apostle John said that there is a mechanism of birth that is according to the will of the flesh. The first mechanism, which is birth by blood, is according to the decision of the parents. But when an identical twin is born, this is not a decision by anyone except the flesh, or rather the fertilized egg. Now, When John wrote this, that there is birth by the will of the flesh, this was well before science understood that multiple pregnancy is due to a cellular process. It was not until the mid-19th century that scientists began to understand that twinning is through cellular division. All along, science thought that identical twins were both a direct product of their parents' act. But scientifically, only one twin is a product of one sperm and one egg. The other is a literal photocopy of the other twin's flesh. And John then also listed a third mechanism, birth by the will of man. This is perhaps the most modern, nor of the will of man. The Greek word used here for man specifically implies a husband or a deliberate agent. It refers to a legal or intentional decision to start a family. In our modern world, this is the ultimate category for IVF and assisted reproduction. In IVF, the will is the primary driver. It isn't a random occurrence or a natural accident. It is a calculated, human-designed and technologically assisted act of will. Today, we have reached a point where the will of man can literally bridge the gap of infertility to create life in a lab. It is the most powerful expression of human agency. So when John wrote about there being a third physical mechanism of reproduction, which is distinct from the natural process and the twinning, this is what he meant. Yet, this was 2,000 years before the first IVF. So here's the breakdown. You have the blood, which is natural inheritance. You have the flesh, which is biological variation, like twinning. And you have the will of man, which is scientific intention, like IVF. So now, when John listed these three distinct physical mechanisms through which a human can be born, it was to show that there is a fourth mechanism which is not like these other ones. And he called this fourth mechanism birth by God, and he said it is a spiritual birth. So whether you are born naturally, born as a twin, or born through a doctor's intervention, there is yet a fourth birth which is not physically initiated. It's a conception that doesn't use DNA, doesn't split cells, and doesn't rely on a pipette, but requires the Spirit. The Apostle Paul explained how the mechanisms of this fourth type of birth actually work. You see, in molecular biology, it has been discovered that cells in the body die on a daily basis, while new ones are created in order to replace the old and worn-out ones. For example, if you cut off a fingernail, a new one grows. Or if you bleed, more blood is created in the body. Or if you scrap off a piece of your skin, new one is created. So through cellular regeneration, it is estimated that by the time a person gets to around the age of 70, they would have replaced almost all of the cells they were born with. In other words, by the time you are around 70, you would have a new body different from the one you were born with. In a way, this is reproduction of a new body, except that your mind remains the same. In fact, science shows that while your body replaces almost every cell, your neurons, the hardware of your thoughts, stay with you the longest. And this is why Paul said that the body can be regenerated, but the real transformation requires the renewal of the mind. And scientifically, we now know that it is because the mind is the only thing that persists through the body's physical cycles. Yet Paul said this in Romans 12, verse 2 centuries before the discovery of molecular biology. So is this all a coincidence to you? Was it divine inspiration for the authors of the Bible to have such an in-depth understanding of molecular biology? Considering that one of them, Luke, was in fact a scientist. Even the Greek words that Luke used in his gospel often implies a level of observation that was rare for his time. Tell us what you think in the comments sections. If you like digging into the science of the Bible, hit that subscribe button. We'll see you next time at the Bible Nerd Club.